When my husband sat me down for a serious talk, he said, "I've already asked your sister to be my girlfriend," and she said yes. I sat down across from my husband that evening expecting an argument. We'd had plenty of them lately, the kind of arguments that circle the same wound over and over without ever actually healing it. Marcus had asked me to sit, told me we needed to talk seriously, and I remember bracing myself the way you brace yourself for weather you've already lived through a dozen times. I was not braced for what actually came out of his mouth. He looked me directly in the eyes. Calm, almost gentle, the way you'd deliver news you'd rehearsed, and said, "I've already asked your sister Elena to be my girlfriend, and she said yes." I want to tell you I screamed. I want to tell you I threw something, that I cried, that I did any of the things you'd expect from a woman whose husband had just detonated her entire life in a single sentence. But I didn't. I just sat there, completely still, waiting for my body to catch up with what my ears had just heard. Elena wasn't just my younger sister. She was the person I trusted more than anyone alive. Growing up, she was the one who crawled into my bed during thunderstorms. The one who called me crying after her first heartbreak at 19 and again after her second. The one person in this world I would have sworn, without a second of hesitation, would never do something like this to me. I left the house that night without saying another word to Marcus. I drove straight to Elena's apartment, my hands shaking so badly on the steering wheel I nearly missed my own exit twice. I expected an apology when she opened the door. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, something closer to exhaustion than guilt, and said, "I'm sorry, Victoria, but I didn't steal your husband. He came to me." Then she told me something that made the ground beneath me feel even less stable. Marcus had been secretly contacting her for almost a year. I stood in Elena's living room that night, still in my coat, refusing to sit down, refusing to accept a glass of water she kept trying to hand me, like this was a normal conversation between sisters instead of the unraveling of my entire marriage. "Show me," I finally said. "Show me everything." She hesitated for a moment before pulling out her phone and opening a thread of messages between her and my husband. I scrolled through them with a kind of sick, hollow focus, watching Marcus's familiar voice, his particular way of phrasing things, the little jokes he used to make with me, now aimed at my own sister. At first, it looked exactly the way I'd feared. Flirtation, late-night conversations, the slow, deliberate build of something that shouldn't have existed at all. But then I noticed something strange. The thread had a start date, and it wasn't nearly as far back as it should have been if this had truly been going on for a year, the way Elena claimed. "Where are the earlier messages?" I asked her. Elena went very quiet. "Elena!" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Where are they?" She sat down slowly on her couch, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she looked genuinely afraid. Not of me, I would understand later, but of what she was about to tell me. "There was never an affair, Victoria," she said quietly. "Not a real one." I didn't understand, not yet. "I've been pretending," she continued. "Something much worse than an affair." I sat down across from my sister that night, my coat still on, my mind refusing to fully process what she was telling me. Elena explained that months earlier, she'd noticed something strange in a conversation with Marcus. A slip. An offhand comment that didn't quite fit the version of our marriage he usually presented to the family. Instead of ignoring it, she'd started paying closer attention. What she eventually discovered turned my stomach in a way even the affair hadn't managed to. Marcus had been secretly moving money out of our joint accounts for months. Small transfers at first, easy to overlook if you weren't looking closely, then larger ones disguised behind business language I never would have questioned. He'd also quietly transferred ownership of 2 of our properties I believed were still jointly held, into accounts I had never seen before. And somewhere along the way, he had taken out loans using my financial information without my knowledge or my signature. His plan, Elena told me, was simple in the way only truly cruel plans manage to be. Divorce me. Leave me drowning in debt I didn't even know existed. And walk away with control of a fortune he had spent years quietly positioning himself to inherit through me. "But why would he need you for any of this?" I asked her, my voice barely above a whisper. That was when Elena told me the part that changed absolutely everything I thought I understood about my own family. I'd always believed my father, Richard Brooks, had divided his estate evenly between his children before he passed. It was the kind of thing he would have done. Fair, deliberate, careful never to make either of his daughters feel like less than the other. He hadn't done that at all. Elena explained gently that our father had created a private trust years before his death, one I had never known existed, and I was its primary beneficiary, not equally split, not divided evenly. The overwhelming majority of his estate had been quietly set aside for me specifically, tied up in legal structures neither Elena nor I had ever been told about. Marcus had discovered that trust. And once he had, Elena said, everything about his behavior over the past several years finally made sense. The sudden interest in my father's business dealings after we married, the strange, patient patterns in how he'd handled our finances, the quiet manipulation I'd mistaken for years for simple financial caution. He hadn't married me because he loved me. He'd married me because of what I didn't even know I had. I sat with that realization for a long time in Elena's living room, feeling something inside me go very cold and very still. But there was still one piece of the puzzle I didn't yet understand. How had Marcus found out about a trust that even I hadn't known existed? It took several days of quiet, careful digging before I found my answer, and when I did, it hurt in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. The confidential financial documents Marcus had been using, records detailing my father's trust, information that should never have left our family attorney's office, could only have come from someone inside my own family. The culprit was my mother. Patricia Brooks had secretly helped Marcus access my financial information. Not out of malice toward me, exactly, or so she would later claim through tears I still don't fully know how to interpret. She believed, in her own twisted logic, that I was selfishly keeping an inheritance that should have been shared more evenly with my sister. She thought she was correcting an old unfairness. What she never understood, what Marcus made absolutely certain she never understood, was that he had no intention of sharing anything with anyone. He intended to take all of it, for himself. I remember sitting across from my mother during that conversation, watching her cry and feeling something strange and complicated settle over me. Not quite forgiveness, not quite the rage I probably should have felt. Just a tired, aching sadness at how easily the people closest to me had been pulled into something so ugly, each for their own reasons, each convinced they were justified. But I still had one question left, the one that mattered most. I finally asked Elena the question that had been sitting like a stone in my chest since the night this all began. Then why did you tell him yes? She broke down completely, the composed, careful version of herself she'd maintained through most of our conversations, finally giving way to something rawer. She explained that once she discovered what Marcus was truly planning, she made a decision she knew I might never fully forgive her for. She agreed to play along, to let him believe she wanted him, to let him grow comfortable and careless around her, because it was the only way to get close enough to see the full shape of what he was doing. She had secretly recorded their conversations. She had saved every message, every incriminating detail he'd let slip in moments he believed were private and safe. She had quietly copied financial documents he'd shown her, trying to convince her to help him access even more of what he believed would eventually be his. She had spent months building a case against the man who had destroyed my trust in almost everyone I loved. I wanted to believe her. Some small, exhausted part of me did, even then. But after everything, after learning my husband had been manipulating me for years, after learning my own mother had helped him, trust didn't come easily anymore, not even for my sister. That was when Elena reached into her bag and pulled out something I hadn't expected at all, an envelope. Old, slightly worn at the edges, with my father's handwriting across the front. I opened that envelope with trembling hands, and inside was a letter my father had written before his death. One Elena had apparently been holding on to, waiting for the exact right moment to give it to me. In it, my father explained something that made my chest tighten in an entirely new way. He had suspected, even years earlier, that Marcus might eventually try to exploit me. He'd never said anything directly. He wasn't the type of man to accuse someone without proof. but he had quietly arranged for a private investigator, a man named Nathan Cole, to monitor Marcus's financial activities from a careful distance. Nathan had been watching my husband for months, long before Elena ever discovered anything on her own, and in that time, he had gathered evidence that Marcus had committed serious financial fraud, evidence that had been waiting, carefully preserved for exactly the moment it would be needed. My father, even from beyond his own death, had been protecting me. I sat with that letter for a long time that night, feeling something shift inside me. The fear and heartbreak of the past several days hadn't disappeared. But underneath it, something steadier was beginning to take shape. I wasn't going to fall apart in front of Marcus. I was going to make him believe he'd won. Over the following weeks, I became someone I barely recognized in the mirror. Calm, agreeable, quietly compliant in a way that felt almost physically painful to maintain. I told Marcus I accepted the divorce. I told him through gritted teeth and a carefully composed expression that I had forgiven Elena. I even told him I was willing to sign whatever documents he eventually put in front of me. I watched him relax in real time, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders as he became convinced I was exactly the broken, defeated woman he'd expected me to become. He grew careless, confident. He stopped being as cautious with his conversations around Elena. He stopped double-checking the documents he handed me, assuming I was too devastated to read them closely. That carelessness was exactly what Nathan Cole and I had been waiting for. Marcus chose our family's annual dinner to make his announcement official. Standing at the head of the table, one arm around Elena's shoulders, informing the entire family that the two of them were now together. I watched the room go quiet, watched relatives exchange uncomfortable glances, clearly expecting me to cry, to leave the table, to do anything other than what I actually did. I stood calmly. I raised my glass. "Congratulations," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "I actually brought something for both of you." I placed a thick folder on the table in front of Marcus. Inside were bank statements documenting every transfer he'd made from our joint accounts. Property transfer records proving exactly how he'd quietly moved ownership away from me. Recordings Elena had secretly captured over months of careful, patient work. Fraudulent documents bearing a signature that wasn't actually mine, no matter how convincingly it had been forged. And copies of every secret message he'd sent my sister, laid out in full for our entire family to see. Marcus went completely silent, his face draining of color in front of everyone he'd been so certain would never learn the truth. Then Elena stood beside me. "And I have one more thing," she said. She played a recording from her phone, Marcus's own voice, clear and unmistakable, admitting that he had never actually loved either of us, that he had only ever wanted access to my inheritance, that his plan had always been to use Elena to destroy my trust in my own family, take control of everything my father had left me, and eventually abandon my sister as well, once she was no longer useful to him. The entire room went completely silent. Marcus tried desperately to claim the recordings were fabricated, his voice climbing higher with every word, panic finally cracking through the calm confidence he'd worn all evening. That was when Nathan Cole walked into the room. I hadn't told anyone else he would be there. I watched Marcus's face change entirely as Nathan approached the table and placed one final document down in front of him, a forensic report proving, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Marcus had altered financial records and forged my signature across multiple documents. But there was one more surprise waiting for him, the one I'd been saving for exactly this moment. I had never actually signed the divorce papers he'd given me weeks earlier. Elena had warned me, quietly before I ever agreed to play along, that those documents had been carefully designed to transfer whatever remained of my assets directly into Marcus's control. So I had signed nothing at all. Every document he believed was safely filed away in his favor was, in reality, entirely worthless. I watched the realization land on his face in real time. The perfect plan he'd spent years constructing collapsed in front of an entire room of witnesses, in front of the family he'd tried so carefully to turn against each other. The aftermath moved quickly once the truth was finally out in the open. Marcus lost our marriage, lost every ounce of access he'd been counting on to my father's fortune, and eventually faced serious legal consequences for the fraud Nathan's investigation had so thoroughly documented. My mother was forced to admit, in front of the family she'd tried to protect in her own misguided way, exactly what she had done. She begged both Elena and me for forgiveness. I wasn't ready to give her that forgiveness right away. I'm still not entirely sure when or if I fully will be. Some betrayals take longer to heal than others, even when you understand the twisted reasoning behind them. But Elena, my sister, who had risked everything, including my trust in her to protect me, I forgave completely. We sat together weeks later, finally able to talk without the weight of secrets between us, finally able to be simply sisters again instead of two women caught in someone else's carefully constructed trap. That evening, I opened my father's final letter one more time, reading the words he'd left for me long before any of this began. A man who truly loves you will never ask you to choose between him and the people who love you. I closed the letter, looked over at Elena, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. A real one. Not the careful, practiced version I'd worn through every family dinner and every calculated conversation with Marcus. He thought Elena saying yes meant he had finally won. He never once understood that her yes was never the beginning of his victory. It was the beginning of his downfall.